"Your decisions belong to us now. Pack your bags and get out," screamed the arrogant new CEO. I smiled, unplugging the encrypted Designated key from my workstation. By Monday morning, the $28 million factory stood completely still. The fluorescent lights of the engineering office buzzed with a low, grating hum that mirrored the tension in my chest. Bradley Vance, our 32-year-old CEO who had inherited Vanguard Casting and Tooling after his father-in-law retired 2 years ago, stood at the head of the mahogany conference table. His tailored gray suit looked immaculate, but his face was flushed with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Beside him sat Oliver Higgins, the newly hired chief operating officer, tapping his fingers impatiently on a stack of thick legal documents. The folder in front of them was labeled Ningbo Precision Outsourcing Proposal. Bradley didn't look me in the eye. Instead, he stared at his gold watch, then gestured toward the door. "Charles, your services are no longer required here. The board has decided to move in a more cost-effective direction. We are outsourcing our custom casting molds to an overseas partner, and your high salary simply doesn't fit our new operating budget. Hand over your keycard, clean out your desk, and leave the building immediately." I didn't yell. I didn't slam my hands on the table. I simply leaned back in my chair, looked Bradley straight in the eye, and felt a strange, cold calm wash over me. "Understood," I said. It was the only word I uttered before standing up, taking my personal CAD keyboard and walking out of the room. They thought they had just laid off a 51-year-old dinosaur who was holding them back. They had no idea that they had just pulled the pin on a financial grenade that was about to obliterate their $28 million manufacturing empire. To understand why Bradley and Oliver's decision was so catastrophic, you have to understand how Vanguard Casting and Tooling operated. I had been the lead industrial designer at the company for 21 years. I joined Vanguard in 2005, back when it was a small, struggling machine shop with 10 employees, run by the original founder, Richard Vanguard. Richard was a brilliant engineer who valued precision above everything else. He realized early on that the future of heavy industry lay in custom casting molds for high-pressure valves, turbine blades, and chemical processing impellers. These weren't standard parts you could buy off a shelf. They were massive, complex pieces of metal that had to withstand thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch. If a valve failed in a chemical plant, the resulting explosion could cost millions of dollars in lives. For the first decade, I worked 80-hour weeks, developing our proprietary design database. In 2011, after a major competitor tried to poach me, Richard and I signed a formal agreement. I wasn't just an employee, I was a creator. Under the C. Miller CAD Impeller Library License Agreement of 2011, I retained personal ownership and copyrights to the 34 master parametric design templates that formed the foundation of Vanguard's entire product line. These CAD templates were incredibly complex. They weren't static 3D models. They were mathematically active files. If a client needed a turbine housing that was 12% larger with a 7-degree tilt on the blades, my parametric formulas automatically recalculated the stress points, wall thicknesses, and flow dynamics. Richard knew how valuable this was, which was why the 2011 contract explicitly stated that Vanguard Casting and Tooling was granted a non-transferable, revocable license to manufacture products using these design templates. The critical clause, Clause 14 BAP, stipulated that this license was strictly contingent upon my active employment at Vanguard. If my employment was terminated without cause, the license would automatically expire exactly 48 hours after my termination. Furthermore, the contract stated that any continued unauthorized use of the templates or the manufacturing of molds derived from them would carry a statutory penalty of $150,000 per manufactured unit, and Vanguard would be liable for copyright infringement under Title 17 of the United States Code. For 15 years, this arrangement worked beautifully. Vanguard grew from a small local shop into a premier regional manufacturer with $28 million in annual revenue. Our crown jewel was the Midwest Energy Group contract. Midwest Energy was a massive utility company that relied on us for custom turbine impellers. That single contract was worth $8.5 million annually, representing nearly 30% of Vanguard's total revenue. The impellers we made for them were highly specialized. They required 5-axis CNC milling, and the tolerances were down to a fraction of a millimeter. But then, Richard Vanguard retired in 2024. He handed the reins to his son-in-law, Bradley Vance. Bradley was a business school graduate who had never stepped foot on a factory floor before taking the job. To him, the hum of the CNC machines wasn't a symphony of American manufacturing. It was a loud, expensive liability. He looked at the balance sheets and saw that the factory workers and engineers were the highest cost center. Within 6 months of taking over, Bradley brought in Oliver Higgins, a ruthless efficiency consultant, as our COO. Oliver was the kind of executive who believed that everything could be made cheaper if you outsourced it to a country with fewer labor laws. From the moment Oliver arrived, he and Bradley began whispering in corners. They stopped consulting me on new custom client orders. Instead, they kept asking me to export my master CAD files into neutral file formats like STEP or IGs. I knew exactly what they were planning. A neutral format strips away the parametric formulas, but it still gives a machinist the exact geometry of the design. They wanted my blueprints so they could send them to Ningbo Precision Limited, a cheap manufacturing facility in China, and bypass our high-precision workshop entirely. What they didn't realize was that our workshop wasn't just a place with heavy machinery. It was a delicate ecosystem. The CNC programmers and machinists on the floor, led by our shop foreman, Walter Schultz, had worked with me for decades. Walter was 55, a veteran machinist who could tell if a milling cutter was dull just by the sound of the metal scraping. Walter and I had a mutual system. When I created the CAD files, I didn't just upload them to the company server. I digitally signed them using a localized hardware security dongle that was plugged into my workstation. Without my active cryptographic signature, the proprietary post-processors on the 5-axis CNC machines could not translate the CAD files into G-code. The raw coordinate instructions that told the machines how to cut the metal. Bradley and Oliver thought they were being clever. They believed that because the CAD files were saved on the company's shared drive, they owned them. They assumed that once they got rid of me, they could just copy the files onto a USB drive, email them to Ningbo Precision, and pocket the savings. They estimated that outsourcing the molds would save the company $1.2 million a year, which would boost Bradley's annual bonus significantly. They were so blinded by greed that they forgot to read the contracts in my HR file, and they had absolutely no idea how our manufacturing software actually worked. The confrontation had been building for months. It finally reached a boiling point on a hot Tuesday afternoon in July. Oliver Higgins had marched into my design studio, his face pinched with frustration. He dropped a printout on my desk. It was an email from Ningbo Precision, stating that they could not read the CAD models I had uploaded to the shared folder. "Charles, what is the meaning of this?" Oliver demanded, crossing his arms. "Ningbo says the files are encrypted. They can't import them into their CNC post-processors. They're just getting a corrupted block of data." I didn't look up from my monitor. The files are compiled using my active digital signature. The post-processor scripts are proprietary, and they require validation from my local security key. I've told you this before, Oliver. We don't send raw, unencrypted CAD databases to external vendors. It violates our security protocol, not to mention my personal licensing agreement with Vanguard. Oliver let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Your licensing agreement? Charles, you are an employee. Everything you build here belongs to Vanguard Casting and Tooling. Bradley and I are the ones who run this company, and we decided that these files are going to China. I want you to strip the encryption and upload the raw files by 5 o'clock today." "I can't do that," I said calmly. "First, doing so would allow an external entity to clone our designs without tracking, which ruins our quality control. Second, those templates are registered under my name. The license only permits Vanguard to manufacture them in-house under my supervision." Oliver leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you're indispensable, Charles? You're just a draftsman who got lucky. We don't need your supervision. We need margins. If you won't cooperate, we will find someone who will." He spun on his heel and stormed out. I knew then that my time at Vanguard was short. That evening, I called Sarah Jenkins, my intellectual property attorney. Sarah had been representing me since Richard Vanguard, and I drafted the original contract in 2011. I explained the situation to her. "They're going to fire me, Sarah," I said, "and they're going to try to steal the library." Sarah chuckled on the other end of the line. "Let them try. The contract is ironclad, Charles. I have the certified registration from the U.S. Copyright Office for all 34 parametric design templates. The moment they terminate you, the clock starts. They have 48 hours to cease all production. If they make a single casting after that, they are in willful violation. Under Title 17, Section 504, we can sue for statutory damages of up to $150,000 per infringement. Plus, we can file a federal injunction to freeze their shipping docks." "What about the CNC machines on the factory floor?" I asked. "If the digital signature is tied to your active employment, you have every right to revoke the credentials the moment you are no longer an employee," Sarah replied. "The license for the post-processor software is in your name. If they try to bypass it, they are hacking their own systems." Armed with that knowledge, I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, I was called into the boardroom for the meeting that ended my 21-year career. Bradley Vance sat there, trying to look imposing. Oliver Higgins looked triumphant. Bradley pushed a single sheet of paper toward me. It was a termination letter. "We're restructuring the engineering department, Charles," Bradley said, his voice flat. "Your role as lead industrial designer is being eliminated. We've hired a junior CAD drafter at 1/3 of your salary to handle minor modifications. You are to pack your things and leave immediately." "No severance. No severance," I asked, looking at the paper. "My contract stipulates 12 months of severance if I am terminated without cause." Oliver chimed in, a nasty smirk on his face. "We are terminating you for cause, Charles. Refusal to follow direct orders from executive management. You refuse to supply the necessary CAD files to our manufacturing partner. That is insubordination. You're lucky we aren't suing you for damages." I looked at Bradley. "Is this your final decision, Bradley? Your father-in-law would be ashamed of this." Bradley's face hardened. "Richard is retired, and his old ways of running this company are dead. We need to cut costs to survive, and you are a luxury we can no longer afford. Sign the termination receipt, hand over your keycard, and get out." I didn't sign the paper. I simply folded it and put it in my breast pocket. I stood up, looked at both of them, and said, "Understood." I walked back to my office under the watchful eyes of an HR representative they had hired to escort me. The entire design department was silent. My younger colleagues looked shocked. I calmly packed my personal belongings into a cardboard box, my coffee mug, my family photos, and my custom mechanical keyboard. Lastly, I reached to the back of my computer tower. I unplugged a small black USB device. It was my hardware security token, the digital key containing my cryptographic signature. The HR representative didn't even blink. To her, it was just another thumb drive. She had no idea that this tiny piece of plastic and silicone was the only bridge connecting our CAD database to the multi-million-dollar CNC milling machines on the factory floor. I walked out of the Vanguard building at exactly 2 p.m. on Thursday. As I drove out of the parking lot, I checked my watch. The 48-hour countdown had officially begun. At 2 p.m. on Saturday, Vanguard Casting and Tooling would lose all legal rights to manufacture, sell, or distribute a single product based on my designs. And without my security token, their factory floor was about to become a very quiet, very expensive museum. The moment I arrived at my home office, I set the cardboard box on my desk and sat down in front of my personal computer. I plugged in the hardware security token. I opened the administrator panel for the proprietary post-processor software that translated my design files into machine language. Every single custom impeller and high-pressure valve manufactured by Vanguard was cut on their 5-axis CNC milling machines. These machines were incredibly advanced, but they were also incredibly stupid. They couldn't read a CAD file directly. They needed a post-processor, a customized piece of software that translated the 3D curves of my designs into raw G-code, the precise coordinates that told the machine's spindle where to move, how fast to spin, and at what angle to cut. I had personally written the post-processor macros and scripts over a 10-year period, optimizing them for Vanguard's specific machines. I owned the intellectual property rights to those scripts, and the software license was tied to my personal developer account. With a few clicks, I navigated to the user management console. I located the active certificate linked to Vanguard's server. I hit Revoke Certificate. Immediately, the server connection severed. Without my active cryptographic signature, any new CAD file created or modified in Vanguard's system would be blocked from compiling into G-code. The existing G-code files already loaded into the CNC machine's local memories could still run. But the moment they tried to run a new order or modify an existing design, the machine controllers would throw a fatal compilation error. Next, I called Sarah Jenkins. "It's done, Sarah," I said. "The certificate is revoked, and I am officially unemployed." "Excellent," Sarah replied, the sound of keyboard clicking audible in the background. "I have drafted the formal cease and desist notice. It states that under Clause 14B of your licensing agreement, Vanguard's license to use the C. Miller CAD impeller library will terminate at exactly 2 p.m. this Saturday. I am sending a copy via certified mail to Bradley Vance's home, Oliver Higgins's home, and the Vanguard headquarters. I am also sending an official email notification to their general counsel." "Do you think they'll ignore it?" I asked. "Oh, they will definitely try," Sarah said with a chuckle. "They think they can just ignore a boomer designer and outsource the files to China. But they don't understand that the moment they send those files to Ningbo Precision, they are committing international copyright theft. If they proceed, we will contact the Customs and Border Protection Agency. We can block their incoming shipments at the port of entry under Section 337 of the Tariff Act of 1930. On Friday morning, my phone rang. It was Walter Schultz, the shop foreman. Walter and I had been friends for 20 years. We had shared countless lunches and beers after long shifts. "Hey, Charles," Walter said, his voice low. "The circus has already started down here." "What's going on, Walter?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Well, Bradley and Oliver brought in some 24-year-old kid today," Walter said, laughing quietly. "They introduced him as the new head of design. The kid looks like he's still in college." About an hour ago, Bradley rushed onto the floor. Midwest Energy just placed an urgent order for 3 custom 24-inch turbine impellers. They need them by next Friday because one of their power plants has an outage. "Let me guess," I said. "They tried to load the CAD file." "Yep," Walter said. "The kid tried to export the parametric CAD model to compile the G-code for the Haas 5-axis mill. The machine control panel just flashed a red screen. It says, Error 904, cryptographic signature invalid. License revoked. The kid has been sweating bullets, trying to bypass it for the past 2 hours. He tried to reinstall the software, but now the CNC controller is completely locked out. He asked me if I knew the master override password. And what did you tell him?" "I told him I'm just a dumb machinist who pushes buttons," Walter chuckled. "I told him the only person who knows the master post-processor key is Charles Miller, and they fired him yesterday." "Good man." "Walter," I said, "just do your job. Don't touch anything they tell you to bypass. If they ask you to run the machines on unverified code, refuse. Tell them it's a safety hazard. If a 5-axis mill flies off its coordinates because of uncompiled code, it will shatter a $50,000 spindle and throw shrapnel through the cabin window." "Oh, I know," Walter said. "I'm not risking my fingers or my machines for these idiots." Bradley is pacing around the office, screaming into his phone. He thinks it's a server glitch. He's called our IT contractor, but they don't know anything about the post-processor licenses. "Let him scream," I said. "The real fun starts tomorrow at 2 p.m. By Friday afternoon, Bradley's panic must have escalated. I received 3 phone calls from Oliver Higgins. I didn't answer. I let them go straight to voicemail. The first voicemail was Oliver trying to sound professional. "Charles, this is Oliver. We're having some technical difficulties with the CAD server. We need you to call us back immediately to assist the IT team. We will pay you for your hourly consulting time." The second voicemail 2 hours later was less professional. "Charles, we know you did something to the system. The CNC machines are locked. This is company property. If you don't call us back and provide the override codes, we will contact our legal team and sue you for sabotage." I forwarded both voicemails to Sarah Jenkins. She replied with a simple text message, "Let them sweat. Their legal threats are hot air. They have no case for sabotage because you only withdrew your personal license and security token, which you legally own. Keep your phone on silent. Saturday came and went. At exactly 2 p.m., the license for Vanguard to use my designs officially expired. They were now operating in the red zone. If they ran a single turbine blade, they were committing federal copyright infringement. On Monday morning, the real storm made landfall. On Monday morning, the Vanguard casting and tooling offices descended into absolute chaos. At 8:30 a.m., a process server walked into Vanguard's lobby and hand-delivered a stack of legal documents to the receptionist. 10 minutes later, Bradley Vance and Oliver Higgins received the physical copies of the cease and desist letter. The letter was accompanied by certified copies of my 34 U.S. copyright registrations, along with a draft of a federal copyright infringement lawsuit. But that was only the first blow. The second blow came at 9 a.m. when Donald Henderson, the vice president of operations at Midwest Energy, called Bradley's office. Donald was 53 years old, a no-nonsense executive who had worked with Richard Vanguard for 2 decades. "Bradley?" Donald's voice boomed through the speakerphone. "I just got a call from Walter Schultz. He tells me that Vanguard cannot start production on our 3 custom turbine impellers because the CAD design library is locked. What the hell is going on? We have a power plant shutting down next Friday. If we don't have those impellers on site for installation by then, it will cost our company $180,000 a day in lost power generation. Our contract states that Vanguard is liable for a $500,000 penalty for late delivery. I need answers." Bradley stuttered, trying to find his words. "Donald, it's just a temporary technical issue. Our IT team is working on it. We've actually partnered with an overseas facility, Ningbo Precision, to help us scale production. We're going to expedite the molds." "Ningbo Precision?" Donald growled. "Our contract explicitly states that all casting and machining must be done in the United States at your certified facility for security and quality compliance. If you outsource this without our written approval, you are in immediate breach of contract. We will terminate the agreement, sue you for the full damages, and take our business to your competitor." Bradley promised Donald that everything would be resolved by the afternoon, then slammed the phone down. He turned to Oliver Higgins, his face pale. "How did Donald find out about the lockout?" "It was Walter," Oliver hissed. "He refused to run the Haas 5-axis mill on the old G-code files we found in the local memory. He said it was a safety hazard. I threatened to fire him, and he told me that if I did, the entire shop floor would walk out with him." "Where are the raw CAD files?" Bradley demanded. "Can't we just copy them and email them to Ningbo anyway? Let's get them to start milling. We'll deal with Donald later." "We tried," Oliver muttered, looking down. "Ningbo's lead engineer emailed us an hour ago. He said the files we sent are encrypted CAD blocks. They can't access the parametric design tables to adjust the shrinkage allowance for their casting molds. And worse, they received a formal notice from Charles's attorney. The attorney warned them that the CAD database is copyrighted property, and if Ningbo manufactures any molds based on those files, Charles will file a Section 337 action with the U.S. International Trade Commission to seize the shipments at the port of entry." Ningbo's legal department immediately ordered their factory floor to halt all work on our project. They don't want to get dragged into a U.S. federal lawsuit. Bradley sank into his chair. His plan to save $1.2 million by firing me had just jeopardized Vanguard's single largest contract, worth $8.5 million. If they lost Midwest Energy, the company would be unable to meet its debt obligations to the bank, and bankruptcy would be inevitable within months. "Call Charles," Bradley ordered. "Get him on the phone now." Oliver dialed my number. I let it ring. He dialed again. Nothing. Finally, Bradley took his personal cell phone and sent me a text message. "Charles, we need to talk. We are prepared to offer you your 12 months of severance pay, plus a consulting fee of $20,000 to resolve this technical issue immediately." I forwarded the message to Sarah. 5 minutes later, Sarah sent a formal email to Vanguard's general counsel. "Mr. Miller will not discuss any business matters directly with Vanguard management. If Vanguard wishes to negotiate, CEO Bradley Vance and CEO Oliver Higgins must attend a meeting at my law office at 2 p.m. today. Bring your general counsel. If you fail to attend, we will file the copyright infringement lawsuit in federal district court at 3 p.m. And we will contact the EPA and OSHA regarding your proposed outsourcing of safety-critical chemical valve castings at 1:55 p.m. Bradley, Oliver, and their corporate attorney, a tired-looking man named Richard. Wait, Richard is fine, not on the banned list. Let's make sure, walked into Sarah's conference room. I was already sitting there, sipping a cup of coffee. Bradley didn't even sit down before he started talking. Charles, this is ridiculous. You're holding our company hostage over a server issue. Those CAD files were created while you were employed by Vanguard. They belong to us. Sarah Jenkins smiled calmly, opening a folder. She slid 3 documents across the table. Mr. Vance, let me correct you, Sarah said. First, these are the U.S. Copyright Office registrations for the C. Miller CAD Impeller Library, registered in 2011, 2016, and 2021. Second, this is the 2011 licensing agreement signed by your father-in-law, Richard Vanguard. If you look at page 4, clause 14b, you will see that the license Vanguard had to use these designs was strictly tied to Charles's active employment. You terminated him without cause last Thursday at 2 p.m. The license expired 48 hours later, on Saturday at 2 p.m. Vanguard's attorney picked up the contract, read the clause, and sighed. He leaned over and whispered something in Bradley's ear. Bradley's face turned from red to a pasty white. Furthermore, Sarah continued, your COO, Mr. Higgins, attempted to transmit these copyrighted files to Ningbo Precision in China on Friday night. That constitutes an unauthorized export of protected intellectual property and a direct breach of the licensing agreement. Under the terms of the contract, the penalty for unauthorized use is $150,000 per unit. You currently have 34 active product molds in your shop that utilize these designs. If you run a single one of them, you owe my client $5.1 million in contractual penalties alone, before we even discuss federal statutory damages. Oliver Higgins tried to bluster. This is extortion. We can just reprogram the impellers from scratch. We don't need your files. I spoke up for the first time, my voice calm and steady. Go ahead, Oliver. It took me 15 years of fluid dynamics engineering and thermal modeling to perfect those templates. If you hire a junior designer to reprogram them from scratch, it will take them at least 2 years to get the calibrations right. Meanwhile, Midwest Energy's power plant is shut down, and they are charging you $180,000 a day for late delivery. Your competitor is already waiting for your call. The room fell completely silent. Bradley looked at his attorney, desperate for a loophole. The attorney slowly closed his folder, looked at Bradley, and shook his head. They have us, Bradley, the attorney said quietly. If they file the lawsuit and contact Midwest Energy, the company is finished. We need to settle. Bradley Vance sat slumped in his leather chair, looking defeated. He stared at the polished mahogany table, then at his general counsel, who was slowly nodding his head in agreement with Sarah's terms. The arrogance that Bradley had carried into the office just 4 days ago was completely gone. What are your terms, Charles? Bradley asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah Jenkins slid a pre-drafted settlement agreement across the table. Here is what it will take to keep us from filing the lawsuit and notifying Midwest Energy of your breach. First, Sarah said, pointing to the first clause. Vanguard Casting and Tooling will pay Mr. Miller his full 12 months of contractually obligated severance. Based on his salary of $15,000 a month, that is exactly $180,000. This will be paid in a single lump sum wire transfer within 24 hours. Bradley nodded weakly. Fine. What else? Second, Sarah continued, you will immediately terminate the employment of your chief operating officer, Oliver Higgins, for cause. His gross negligence in attempting to illegally export copyrighted files and exposing the company to millions of dollars in liability constitutes a clear breach of fiduciary duty. He will receive no severance, and he must vacate the Vanguard premises by 5 p.m. today. Oliver jumped out of his chair, his face red with rage. You can't do this, Bradley. You can't let them dictate how we run the company. I was only trying to save us money. Sit down, Oliver, Bradley said, not even looking at him. You almost bankrupted us in 3 months. You're done. Oliver glared at me, grabbed his briefcase, and stormed out of the conference room, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was heavy and satisfying. Third, I spoke up, taking a sip of my coffee. Vanguard will sign a new, non-exclusive licensing agreement for the C. Miller CAD Impeller library. The royalty rate will be 5% of the gross sales of any product manufactured using those templates. Given that the custom impellers and valves generate roughly $15 million in revenue annually, that will amount to approximately $750,000 a year, paid quarterly. If Vanguard fails to pay within 15 days of the end of each quarter, the license is permanently revoked. Bradley winced at the number, but he had no leverage. Agreed, he muttered. Fourth, I said, Walter Schultz will be promoted to operations director of the manufacturing facility with a 20% raise and full veto power over any outsourcing proposals. All manufacturing of the C. Miller designs must remain in-house at the Vanguard facility. No outsourcing, no compromises on quality. If you attempt to outsource any part of these designs again, the license is revoked immediately. And finally, Sarah added, Vanguard will pay a one-time emergency consulting fee of $100,000 to Mr. Miller. This fee covers his services for returning to the facility tomorrow morning, decrypting the CAD database, and reactivating the CNC post-processor certificates so you can fulfill the Midwest Energy order. Once the wire transfer clears, Mr. Miller will restore access. Bradley looked at his attorney one last time. The attorney simply nodded. Sign it, Bradley, he said. It's the only way Vanguard survives the week. With a trembling hand, Bradley took his pen and signed the settlement agreement. The next morning at 8 a.m., the wire transfer cleared into my bank account. The balance showed $280,000, the combined sum of my severance and the emergency consulting fee. At 9 a.m., I walked back onto the Vanguard factory floor. I wasn't wearing my old employee badge. Instead, I wore a visitor's pass labeled Lead Consultant. Walter Schultz was waiting for me by the Haas 5-axis CNC mill. A wide grin was plastered across his face. The rest of the machinists and technicians stood nearby, watching in silence. Good morning, boss, Walter said, offering me a fresh cup of coffee. Morning, Walter, I smiled. Or should I say Operations Director Schultz, Walter chuckled. It has a nice ring to it. Let's get these machines running. I walked over to the main workstation, plugged in my black hardware security dongle, and entered the master developer override credentials. I opened the CAD server and reactivated the digital certificate for the Vanguard workshop. All right, Walter, I said, stepping back. Load the design files for the Midwest Energy impellers. The system is active. Walter signaled the junior designer who was standing nervously in the corner. The kid imported the CAD file and clicked the compile button. This time, there was no red screen and no error 904. The software processed the parametric formulas seamlessly, and the CNC controller screen lit up with thousands of lines of perfect, verified G-code. Walter pressed the cycle start button. The coolant pumps hummed to life, spraying a steady stream of blue fluid over the raw aluminum billet, and the massive spindle roared, cutting into the metal with mathematical precision. The sound of the cutting tool was music to my ears. We delivered the 3 custom turbine impellers to Midwest Energy by Thursday afternoon, a full 24 hours ahead of schedule. Donald Henderson personally called me that evening to thank me. He let me know that he had made it clear to Bradley Vance that if Walter Schultz or I ever walked away from Vanguard again, Midwest Energy would terminate their contract on the spot. I never went back to the office after that week. I didn't need to. I officially retired and moved to a house near the lake. Every quarter, like clockwork, a royalty check for approximately $187,000 clears into my account. I spend my days fishing, woodworking, and working on my own design projects in my home shop, completely free from corporate bureaucracy. Vanguard Casting and Tooling is still operating, but Bradley Vance runs it under the constant, paranoid watch of the board of directors. He cannot buy a piece of sandpaper without their approval, and he knows that any attempt to cut corners will trigger the clause that takes away the core designs of his business. Sometimes, the young executives in their expensive suits think they can replace decades of experience, craftsmanship, and legal foresight with a simple spreadsheet and a cheap outsourcing deal. But they forget that a factory floor isn't just about machines. It's about the people who know how to make them sing, and the contracts that protect the music. And in the end, the boomer designer they tried to throw away was the one who owned the song.